It was supposed to be just another busy evening at the hotel restaurant, the kind of night where the sound of clinking glasses and quiet conversations filled the air. The place wasn't loud, but it carried the steady rhythm of a high-end dining hall used to serving important people. Soft golden lights hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the neatly arranged tables. Every corner looked polished and perfect, as if the staff prepared for a special event every night. In a way, tonight really was special. A group of VIP guests had booked the entire main section for a private charity dinner. Some of them were well-known business figures, others were community leaders, and a few were simply people with enough influence to be invited everywhere. They sat at the center tables, dressed in elegant clothes, speaking in calm but confident tones. Their presence made the restaurant feel different, quieter, heavier, like everyone had to be extra careful. The staff moved quickly but gently between the tables, placing dishes, pouring drinks, and keeping their posture straight. Among them was a young waitress trying her best to stay calm under the pressure. She moved with quiet focus, carrying trays, checking tables, and making sure everything was perfect. She didn't talk much, but she listened to everything. The murmurs, the requests, and the occasional complaint. Nights like this were demanding, yet she handled them with determination. Near the corner of the hall stood a grand piano, glossy and elegant, almost glowing under the soft lights. It had been placed there for a live performance that was supposed to start soon. The hotel had arranged for a pianist to entertain the guests while they enjoyed their dinner. But as time passed, the seat in front of the piano stayed empty. The performer was running late, much later than anyone expected. The manager walked back and forth, checking his watch, tapping his fingers, and whispering short instructions to the staff. He didn't like things going off schedule, especially with such important guests present. Every minute the pianist didn't arrive made him more anxious. The VIPs had begun glancing toward the piano, wondering when the music would start. A few even made comments, light jokes at first, but they were slowly becoming impatient. The young waitress noticed the tension. She kept wiping down tables, refilling glasses, and adjusting silverware, but her eyes kept drifting toward the piano. As well, she wasn't worried about the performer. Specifically, it was the silence the instrument created. It sat there like a spotlight, waiting to be turned on, but instead, it focused attention on the fact that something was missing. The manager finally whispered to one of the senior staff members, trying to hide his frustration. The pianist still hadn't called. No updates, no explanation. Just silence. And in a hall full of VIPs, silence was not comforting. The young waitress walked around the tables near the piano, collecting used plates and napkins. She moved quietly, but inside she felt the pressure building. She wished the performer would hurry up and arrive so everyone could relax a little. She didn't like feeling watched, and tonight, every movement the staff made felt noticed. While clearing a table closest to the piano, she placed a stack of plates on her tray and turned slightly to adjust a chair. Her hip lightly brushed against the edge of the piano bench. Then, without realizing it, her hand landed gently on the piano keys to steady herself. A soft, accidental chord rang out. It wasn't loud, but in the quiet moment between conversations, the sound caught the attention of several guests. A few heads turned toward her. She froze instantly, embarrassed that she had made any sound at all. She pulled her hand back quickly and hoped no one would say anything, but people had noticed. One of the guests near the piano smiled and made a light remark. Something like, "Looks like someone's ready to play." Another gave a small laugh. The comments weren't rude, but they made her cheeks warm. She shook her head politely and tried to focus on her work again. A coworker passing by whispered softly, "Careful, or they'll think you're the entertainment." They laughed under their breath, trying to ease the tension. She smiled a little, but inside something else stirred. Her eyes went to the piano for half a second longer than she meant to. She quickly looked away and continued wiping the table, hoping no one else would notice her reaction. But one of the VIP guests did. They watched her for a moment, curious, as if they sensed something she didn't want to show. The manager approached her, his face tight with worry. He didn't say anything about the sound, but he glanced at the piano with a troubled expression. The performer still hadn't arrived, and time was slipping away fast. The young waitress felt sorry for him. Running an event like this wasn't easy, and anything unexpected could cause stress. She walked back to the service area, trying to stay busy. The scent of freshly cooked dishes drifted through the hallway as the kitchen continued sending out plates. The cooks were working fast, but the silence from the piano corner made the dining hall feel incomplete. She tried to push away, the feeling settling in her stomach, something between nervousness and memory. Her steps slowed a little every time she passed the piano. She could feel its presence in the room more than she wanted to. It was strange how one instrument could suddenly feel so loud without making any sound. More guests started glancing toward the empty piano bench. Their conversations were polite on the surface, but their expressions showed growing impatience. A few of them checked their watches. Others whispered quietly among themselves, wondering if the performer would ever arrive. Manager's stress was starting to show. He kept smoothing his jacket, clearing his throat, and looking toward the entrance as if waiting for a miracle. The young waitress continued her tasks, moving from table to table, but every time she passed near the piano, she felt a quiet tug. Inside, an old, familiar feeling, something she had buried for a long time. She didn't want to think about it, especially not while she was working. But the presence of the piano made it impossible to ignore Gott at one point. She paused beside a table, adjusting 2 water glasses to make them perfectly aligned. Her breathing slowed. She could hear the faint hum of conversation in the background. But her attention drifted again to the piano. It wasn't just an instrument. To her, it was a doorway to a part of her life she didn't talk about anymore. She looked away quickly and forced herself to return to the moment. She picked up a tray, walked toward another table, and reminded herself to stay focused. This was her job, and she didn't want any trouble. But the night continued slipping out of the hotel's careful control. The pianist was nowhere to be seen. The VIP guests were beginning to lose patience. And unknowingly, the young waitress had already become the center of a moment she never expected. She didn't know it yet, but the small sound she made, the tiny accidental chord, had already planted a seed of curiosity in the room. Some guests kept glancing at her when she walked, by wondering if she might actually know how to play. Others simply waited, hoping the real performer would arrive soon. The weight of their attention didn't reach her fully, not yet. But something in the air was shifting, slowly, quietly. She took a deep breath and continued her work, hoping the evening would settle down. But fate had other plans, and the grand piano, silent for now, was waiting for the moment everything would change. The evening kept moving forward, but there was a strange tension in the air, the kind that quietly grows without anyone saying a word. The VIP guests continued eating and talking, yet something about the atmosphere felt off. It wasn't the food, it wasn't the service, everything was running smoothly. It was the silence coming from the piano that made the whole room feel incomplete. That the manager walked back and forth near the entrance, stopping every few minutes to check his phone. Each time he looked at it, his expression grew more troubled. The pianist still hadn't called, hadn't texted, hadn't sent any message at all. The manager tried to hide his frustration, but even the guests could sense something wasn't right. Meanwhile, the young waitress kept moving through the hall, doing her best to stay focused on her work. She refilled glasses, cleared plates, and responded politely to every request. But no matter where she walked, she felt like the piano was watching her. The moment she had touched the keys earlier kept replaying in her mind, even though it had only lasted a second dot. It was supposed to be nothing an accident, just a soft chord she hadn't meant to play. But the sound had stirred something deep inside her, something she had pushed away for a long time. She tried to pretend it didn't bother her. She tried to treat the piano like any other piece of furniture in the restaurant, but it wasn't working. Every time she passed by it, her steps slowed just a little. She kept her head down, yet her eyes drifted toward the glossy surface of the instrument. One of her coworkers noticed her strange behavior. As they passed each other near the service counter, they gave her a curious look. "You okay?" they whispered. She forced a small smile. "Yeah, just a long night." The coworker nodded and went back to work, but she knew she hadn't answered. Honestly, something was bothering her. Not something bad, just something she wasn't ready to face. Her shift was always busy, but tonight felt different. The VIPs were becoming more restless. A few of them leaned back in their chairs, glancing around the room as if searching for something to entertain them. One or two tapped their fingers on the table, perhaps imagining music that wasn't playing. Lack of background sound made every little noise feel louder: the scrape of a chair, the clink of cutlery, the soft rustle of napkins. Normally, the piano would have filled the silence, smoothing out the rough edges of the evening. But instead, the instrument sat untouched, like a beautiful decoration missing its purpose. The young waitress carried a tray of glasses past the piano, and for a moment, her mind drifted back to another time, years earlier, when music had been a bigger part of her life. She had learned to play the piano as a child, practicing every day until her fingers felt numb. She had loved it. She had loved the way the keys felt smooth under her hands, how melodies flowed naturally once she found the right rhythm. But life changed. Responsibilities grew. Work came first. And slowly, the piano became something she no longer touched. She took a quiet breath and forced the memory away. This wasn't the time to think about old dreams. She had a job to do, and she didn't want to stand out. But fate had a strange way of pushing people toward things they didn't want to face. As she was clearing another table near the VIP section, one of the guests looked directly at her. The guest had noticed the small moment earlier, the accidental chord, and had been watching her ever since. Their eyes followed her movements, not in a rude way, but in a curious one. When she approached their table, they smiled politely. "Excuse me," the guest said, "earlier when you touched the piano. It sounded nice. Do you play?" Her heart skipped. She froze for half a second before answering. "Oh no, it was just an accident," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to press anything." The guest studied her face, as if trying to understand whether she was being honest or simply modest. "Well, it didn't sound like a random sound," they said kindly. "Your hand landed on the keys pretty naturally." Her cheeks warmed. She didn't know what to say, so she simply gave a polite smile and continued clearing their plates. She hoped they wouldn't ask more questions. She didn't want attention, not from VIPs, not from staff, not from anyone. Once she walked away, she took a slow breath. Her heart was beating faster than usual. She didn't like being watched, especially not for something she tried so hard to hide. The manager approached her again, this time with a worried whisper. "The performer still isn't here," he said, pressing his hand against his forehead. "I don't know what to tell the guests." "We can't delay much longer." She nodded, unsure how to help. She wanted to say something comforting, but she didn't know what. The manager sighed and walked away again, heading toward the kitchen to check on the next round of dishes. The young waitress continued her tasks, pretending everything was normal. But inside, She felt something growing like a quiet pressure pressing from within. The piano kept drawing her gaze. At one point, she passed by it again, carrying a tray of folded napkins. She glanced at the keys, almost without thinking. They seemed to shine under the lights, as if inviting her to touch them again. She quickly looked away, feeling a strange mix of fear and longing. Her coworker, who had been arranging cutlery near a nearby table, noticed her pause. "You sure you don't play?" They teased softly, raising an eyebrow. She forced a small laugh. Not anymore, but the words felt heavy. They tasted like something unsaid. The coworker didn't push. They just shrugged and went back to their work. But the moment lingered in her mind. Before she could walk away, one of the VIP guests, seated along the far side of the room, raised a hand slightly, signaling for her attention. She hurried over to their table. "Could we get some more water?" "Please?" the guest asked politely. "Of course," she said, nodding. As she turned to leave, another guest at the same table made a quiet comment. "Shame about the music tonight," they said. "We were looking forward to it." She nodded again, unsure how to respond. She didn't want to speak for the hotel or make excuses. When she returned with the water, she overheard one of the guests joking lightly. Maybe the waitress should just play instead. The other guests laughed softly, not unkindly. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured the water. She kept her eyes on the glass to avoid meeting anyone's gaze. It wasn't that the comments bothered her. They weren't meant to embarrass her. It was the idea itself, the possibility, the thought she tried so hard to bury. She moved quickly to another table, trying to escape the attention. But the idea followed her like a shadow. What if she could play? What if she actually sat down and touched the keys again? What if the sound of music filled the hall, easing the tension in the air? But then she thought of her job, of the rules, of the expectations. She wasn't a performer. She wasn't here to entertain anyone. She was just a waitress trying to get through a demanding shift. She told herself it was impossible, but the truth was, deep down, she knew she could play. Her hands still remembered. Her heart still knew the music. She walked back to the service area, hoping a moment of quiet would clear her thoughts. But as she stood there, preparing another tray, she felt someone. Behind her. She turned and saw the manager. He looked exhausted. "I don't know what to do," he admitted in a low voice. "They're expecting something, and we have nothing to give them." She looked at him, unsure what he wanted from her. She couldn't fix the situation. She couldn't magically bring the pianist here. But then he glanced toward the piano. And then he glanced at her. It wasn't a request. It wasn't even a suggestion. It was more like a silent question that he didn't dare ask aloud. A question she didn't want anyone to ask. She shook her head softly, trying to avoid the conversation entirely. But the manager said nothing more. He simply sighed and walked away. Still, the look he gave her lingered. The room buzzed with quiet conversations, but the piano remained untouched. It felt like it was waiting not for the missing performer, but for her. The guests didn't know her story. The staff didn't know either. No one knew what she carried inside, or how much effort it took to keep it hidden. She continued working, but her movements grew slower, more thoughtful. She was battling a part of herself she thought she had locked away forever. The VIPs were growing more restless. The manager was running out of time. The piano sat in the corner, shining softly under the lights, and somewhere deep inside, she felt the beginning of something, an old spark she thought had gone out long ago. She didn't know it yet, but the small accident from earlier was about to lead her into a moment she never expected. A moment that would change not just the evening, but her entire life. The evening inside the grand hall continued to hum with quiet energy as more guests settled into their seats, unaware that something extraordinary was slowly beginning to take shape. While the murmurs of conversation drifted through the air, she stood behind the curtain, her hands gently rubbing against each other, as if trying to warm away the nervousness collecting in her fingertips. She never expected to be in this position. When she first arrived for her regular shift, she only imagined taking orders, clearing tables, and making sure the VIP guests were served without delay. But now, everything had changed. She could still hear the distant echo of their laughter from earlier, a laughter she pretended not to notice as she balanced plates and glasses. They had no idea that the quiet young woman moving from table to table had a story much deeper than the surface they saw. They didn't know that behind her calm expression was a heart trained by years of late-night practice, one that beat in rhythm with music she never got to share. As she waited for the moment she would step out, her mind drifted back to earlier. That day, she remembered waking up before sunrise, just as she always did. The small apartment she lived in was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into the walls and never quite went away. She had gotten used to it. She filled a kettle with water and waited for it to boil as she stood by the window, watching the sky slowly change its colors. She often told herself that one day she would wake up to a different view, a place where she could breathe without carrying the weight of worry. But for now, this was the life she knew, and she accepted it quietly. Before heading out for work, she glanced over at the old keyboard placed near her bed. One of the keys was chipped, another barely made a sound anymore, but it was all she had. She used it every morning before leaving, even if only for 10 minutes. Her fingers danced lightly across the keys, remembering melodies her mind refused to forget. Music was the only thing that never asked her to be anything other than herself. Now, standing in the dark corner behind the curtain of the grand stage, she could feel that same music quietly rising inside her again. She could feel the weight of the moment, but within it, there was something else, something warm, something familiar. She took a slow breath and peeked at the audience through a small gap in the curtain. Guests dressed in expensive suits and elegant gowns sat with straight backs, their attention focused on the stage, unaware of the surprise waiting for them. Some of them had probably never worked a day in their lives the way she had. Others had been successful for so long that they had forgotten what struggle even felt like. But she didn't resent them. She simply hoped they would truly listen, when she played. She heard footsteps approaching behind her. The event coordinator gave her a small nod, the kind that carried both reassurance and urgency. He whispered that the piano was ready, and the audience was waiting. She nodded back, her throat tightening for a moment. She wasn't afraid of the piano. She was afraid of their eyes, their judgment, their doubts, their assumptions. She had seen enough of that already in her life. Still, she reminded herself why she agreed to this. It wasn't for recognition or applause. It wasn't to prove anything to those who looked down on her. She accepted because deep down, she knew she couldn't hide from music forever. Something inside her had been waiting for this moment, and she could feel it more clearly than ever. She stepped toward the stage entrance and waited as the lights dimmed slightly. The room fell almost silent, except for the soft rustling of clothes and whispered conversations. A single spotlight lit the polished black piano sitting at the center of the stage. Its surface reflected the soft glow of the lights above, giving it a presence that felt both delicate and powerful. As she stepped out, she could feel hundreds of eyes drift toward her. Some people leaned forward slightly, confused. Others exchanged glances, as if wondering why a waitress was walking onto the stage, but she didn't look at them. Her gaze stayed fixed on the piano, the one place in the room that felt like home. Her shoes clicked gently on the wooden floor, the sound echoing softly through the hall. She approached the piano with slow, steady steps. Her heart raced, but her face remained calm, almost serene. When she reached the bench, she paused for a second, letting her breath settle. Then she took a gentle seat. The crowd watched in silence, unsure of what was happening. A few people whispered, but the room still held a sense of anticipation, as if everyone sensed something unusual was about to unfold. She lifted her hands and placed them gently on the keys. They felt cool beneath her fingertips, smooth and familiar, despite being different from the old keyboard she practiced on every morning. For a moment, she closed her eyes, letting the room fade away. She imagined herself in her small apartment, in the quiet morning light, playing just for herself. That thought calmed her. Then slowly she began to play. The first note floated into the air, soft and warm. It lingered for a moment, as if testing the room. Then another note followed, and another, each one building upon the last with gentle confidence. Her fingers moved with a grace that came not from formal training, but from years of emotional practice done alone, without an audience, without applause. The room changed instantly. The whispers stopped. The guests sat up straighter. A wave of stillness swept across the hall, the kind that only appeared when something unexpected and extraordinary was happening. She didn't open her eyes. She didn't need to. She knew the keys by feel, knew the rhythm by heart. Her hands glided effortlessly, creating a melody that told stories she never had the courage to say out loud. Every note carried a piece of her life, the quiet struggles, the long nights, the small hopes she kept hidden. As the music deepened, something in the audience shifted. People who had been laughing earlier now leaned forward, their expressions changing from curiosity to awe. Some of them exchanged silent looks, surprised by the emotion pouring out of someone they had dismissed only an hour ago. But she didn't think about that. She didn't think about them at all. She simply played. The melody rose gently, like a soft wind lifting fallen leaves. Then it dipped, tender and fragile, as if whispering secrets only she understood. The room felt alive with emotion, the music, weaving through every corner like a ribbon of light. Near the back of the hall, one of the VIP guests felt something tighten in his chest. He had heard countless professional performers before, but nothing felt quite like this. There was something honest in her playing, something real, something he couldn't explain. It wasn't about technical perfection. It was about the feeling, the raw, unfiltered feeling that poured from every note. Another guest, someone known for being difficult to impress, slowly lowered her glass, suddenly uninterested in anything except the music filling the room. She didn't know who the young woman was or why she was playing, but for the first time that evening, she felt genuinely moved. On the stage, the young woman continued to pour her heart into the keys. She didn't rush. She didn't hold back. She let the music guide her, let it carry her forward as if the piano itself understood her. She felt weight lift from her chest, bit by bit, with every note that left the strings. The melody built again, growing stronger, fuller. It swept across the room like a rising tide, carrying the audience with it. People who barely paid attention at the beginning now found themselves trapped in the emotion of the moment. The atmosphere felt heavy, yet uplifting, like witnessing something both beautiful and rare. As the piece neared its gentle conclusion, she allowed the music to soften once more. Her fingers slowed, letting each note linger in the air before fading into silence. When the final note fell, it hung in the room for a long moment, echoing in a way that felt almost magical. Then everything was quiet. The room didn't erupt into applause. Right away, there was a brief silence, a breath held collectively by everyone present, the kind of silence that only followed something powerful. She slowly opened her eyes, and for the first time since stepping onto the stage, she looked at the audience. What she saw was not judgment. It was awe. Some guests sat frozen, unsure how to react. Others stared wide-eyed, their expressions softened by emotion. A few had their hands slightly raised, as if preparing to clap, but too shocked to begin. She didn't smile. She didn't bow. She simply placed her hands on her lap and took another slow breath. Her heart raced, but she felt lighter than she had in years. At last, someone began to clap, softly at first. Then another joined, and another. Within seconds, the entire hall filled with applause, loud, heartfelt, sincere. She didn't expect it. She didn't play for it. But hearing it now, she felt something warm spread through her chest. The applause grew even louder. Some people rising to their feet, clapping with genuine admiration. She sat there quietly, taking it all in, trying to understand how a moment she never asked for had suddenly changed everything. And deep inside, she knew this was only the beginning. The tension inside the restaurant grew heavier with every passing minute. The VIP guests had settled into their meals, but their eyes kept drifting toward the empty piano seat. It wasn't anger they felt, just disappointment, confusion, and a growing sense of impatience. They had expected a smooth, elegant evening, with background music filling the room, and instead, they were surrounded by an uncomfortable silence. The young waitress continued movie. The applause continued echoing through the hall, long after her fingers had stilled on the keys. She sat quietly, almost unsure of what to do, as the wave of appreciation washed over her. It felt unreal, like she was watching someone else receive that level of praise. But it was her. It was her music. And for the first time in her life, people truly saw her not as a waitress, not as a girl carrying trays, not as someone meant to blend into the background, but as a person with something meaningful to offer. She finally stood up from the bench, her legs slightly shaky, though she wasn't sure if it was nerves or relief. She stepped back from the piano, bowing her head politely without forcing a smile. She didn't need to. The sincerity in her eyes said more than a smile ever could. The applause continued for a few more seconds before fading into softer claps and murmurs. She stepped off the stage, each step slower than the last, as if leaving that spotlight felt heavier than she expected. The coordinator met her behind the curtain with wide eyes and a stunned expression. He whispered that he had no idea she could play like that. She responded with a small nod, unsure of what else to say. She didn't know how to accept praise. She wasn't used to it. As she walked back toward the staff area, she felt her chest tighten. Not with fear, but with something more confusing, an odd mixture of pride, disbelief, and quiet joy. She placed a hand lightly against her chest, almost as if checking that her heartbeat hadn't changed its rhythm. The staff room felt strangely quiet compared to the energy of the hall. Her apron still hung on the hook where she had left it earlier. She reached out and touched it, feeling the familiar fabric beneath her fingers. It grounded her, reminded her of who she was before she stepped onto that stage. She changed back into her work shoes and took a slow breath, preparing to return to her duties. She still had a job to finish. The guests needed service, the tables needed attention, and she didn't want anyone thinking she expected special treatment just because she had played one piece of music. But just as she stepped out of the staff room, she saw one of the VIP guests approaching. He was an older man with kind eyes and an expression that seemed softer than it had earlier in the evening. She paused, unsure if she was supposed to speak first. "You played beautifully," he said, his voice warm and steady. She lowered her gaze slightly and thanked him, her voice almost too soft to hear. He continued, "I've attended events like these for years, but I can't remember the last time a performance felt that real. You have a rare gift." She didn't know how to respond. Compliments like that didn't fit easily into her world. She simply nodded, hoping that would be enough. More guests approached her throughout the next several minutes. Some offered kind words, others asked if she had been trained professionally, and a few simply wanted to shake her hand. Their curiosity felt strange, almost overwhelming. She answered politely, always keeping her tone gentle, but inside she felt like she was drifting through a dream. When she finally returned to the dining area, the atmosphere felt different. People who hadn't paid attention to her before now followed her movements with their eyes. She could feel their admiration, their curiosity, their respect. She didn't crave any of it, but she appreciated the shift, appreciated that something inside the room had changed. She picked up a tray and began serving again. Her steps were steady, her hands sure, but something was different about her tonight. A quiet confidence had taken root inside her, something she didn't fully recognize yet, but felt grateful for. At one table, a woman smiled warmly and softly said, "Thank you for the music." She responded with a small nod and continued her work, but while she kept moving, whispers followed her. Not the mocking kind from earlier. These whispers carried surprise, admiration, even a touch of disbelief. "She's incredible. How did we not know?" She played like she's been trained her whole life. She didn't let the words distract her, though they reached her ears with surprising clarity. She simply kept working, letting her movements blend with the room, while still carrying the warmth of what had just happened. Later in the evening, the host announced a short break between segments of the event. Guests began stretching their legs, some heading toward the open terrace. The cool night breeze brushed through the doorway, bringing with it the sounds of distant traffic and soft laughter. She stepped outside for a moment to breathe. The sky above was dark but clear, dotted with tiny stars that shimmered faintly. She wrapped her arms lightly around herself and closed her eyes, letting the quiet air settle around her. She never imagined this night would unfold the way it did. She had always dreamed of playing for others, but fear and life circumstances kept that dream locked away. Tonight, however, something inside her shifted. A door she didn't realize could open was suddenly wide. She heard footsteps approaching from behind. Turning, she saw the event coordinator walking toward her again, this time with a more serious expression. "There are a few people inside who want to speak with you," he said gently. Her heart skipped. "About what?" "About your performance." She hesitated. She wasn't sure she was ready for more attention, but she nodded anyway. Inside, she found a small group of VIP guests gathered near the main stage. They looked at her with warm expressions, not the judgment they had worn earlier. One of them stepped forward, a woman with a calm presence. "Your performance was extraordinary," the woman said. "We'd love to know more about you. Do you perform anywhere else?" She shook her head softly. "No, I only play at home." The woman raised her eyebrows in surprise. "You've never performed in public?" "No." Another guest chimed in. "You should. You're talented enough to move people. That's something not many musicians can do, no matter how much training they have." A quiet pause settled between them. She felt a flutter in her chest, not fear this time, but something that felt almost like hope. Then came the question she wasn't expecting. "Would you consider playing again later tonight?" Her breath caught. "Again?" "Yes," the woman said. "Just one more piece. Nothing complicated. But many guests would love to hear you again before the event ends." She looked down for a moment, her hands clasping nervously in front of her. The thought of going back on stage so soon felt overwhelming. She had just finished calming her heartbeat, and now it threatened to race again. But then she remembered the silence that followed her last note, the look in the audience's eyes, the warmth that filled her chest. She slowly nodded. "I can." "Try," she said softly. The group smiled. "Please." The coordinator stepped closer. "Take your time. When you're ready, We'll set the stage again." She nodded and stepped away, needing a moment to think. As she walked toward the side of the hall, she paused near the piano. The glossy surface reflected the soft light from above, the keys resting quietly, as if waiting for her touch. She reached out and gently brushed her fingers over the edge of the instrument. She didn't know what she would play next. She didn't know whether she could top the emotion of her first performance. But she knew she wanted to try. This was her chance, one she never expected, one she might never get again. She took a quiet breath and let her fingers rest lightly on the keys, practicing the feel of them without playing a sound. And as she stood there, gathering her courage, she had no idea that the second performance she was about to give would change far more than just the atmosphere of the room. It would change her life. She stood beside the piano, letting her fingers rest on the smooth wooden edge as she tried to steady her breathing. The room behind her was filled with quiet chatter, the kind that came after something unexpected had happened. She could still feel the weight of the applause from her first performance, still hear the softness in the guests' voices when they spoke to her, still sense the shift in how they saw her. But now she faced something different. They wanted her to play again this time because they genuinely wanted to hear her, not out of curiosity or surprise. The thought made her heart flutter in a way she couldn't explain. She took a step back from the piano and walked toward a quiet corner near the stage. She needed a moment to collect herself. Her hands trembled gently, not from fear, but from the overwhelming swirl of emotions inside her. She never expected this night to turn into something so meaningful. When she glanced at the crowd, she could see the guests returning to their seats after the short break. They seemed calmer now, more attentive, as if waiting for something special. The soft lighting made the room glow with a warm mood, adding a peaceful feeling to the space. She wondered for a moment if she belonged on that stage. She wondered if the first performance had been a stroke of luck, a moment of courage she might not be able to recreate. But then she reminded herself of the nights she spent playing in the dark, in her small apartment, never losing her connection to music. Even when life felt heavy. Her hands knew the keys. Her heart knew the rhythm. She just needed to trust herself again. The event coordinator approached her with a gentle smile. He spoke softly so only she could hear. "Whenever you're ready, we'll dim the lights." She took a slow breath. "I just need a minute." He nodded and stepped away. She closed her eyes for a moment, imagining her small apartment. She pictured herself sitting at her old keyboard, pressing the worn keys that struggled to keep up with her fingers. She imagined the early mornings, the quiet afternoons, the late nights when music was the only thing that kept loneliness away. It was always just her and the sound. Inside that memory, she felt safe. Inside that memory, she felt capable. When she opened her eyes again, something inside her had settled. Not completely, but enough. She walked toward the piano once more. The coordinator signaled the lighting team, and slowly the room dimmed again, until only the soft spotlight on the piano remained. The quiet in the hall grew deeper, as if everyone sensed the beginning of another moment worth remembering. She stepped onto the stage, her steps slow but confident. People watched her with calm anticipation this time. They weren't confused anymore. They weren't surprised. They were simply waiting with open minds. She reached the piano bench, sat down gently, and let her hands hover over the keys. This time, she didn't close her eyes. She kept them open, gazing down at the keys as if greeting old friends. She wanted to stay present. She wanted to feel the moment. She began to play. The first note floated out soft and warm, but different from the earlier melody. This one carried something gentler, like a quiet confession whispered into the air. Her fingers moved slowly at first, each touch full of care, as if she were guiding the music out of her heart, one piece at a time. The guests leaned in, the room falling into complete stillness. The sound of forks, glasses, or shifting chairs disappeared entirely. It felt as if every person in the room held their breath. She started building the melody gradually, weaving soft notes with slightly stronger ones, creating a rhythm that filled the space without overwhelming it. It felt like the calm after a storm, like the moment when someone sits quietly and lets their emotions settle. Her fingers glided smoothly, moving with a natural flow she didn't have to think about. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She wasn't trying to repeat the magic of her first performance. She was simply expressing something real, something she had held inside for years. With each note, she poured her memories into the music, memories of quiet mornings, of long work shifts, of small triumphs no one ever saw. Some notes held hints of sadness. Others carried the softness of hope. She let them all blend into the melody dot in the audience. People felt something shift again. A few guests who normally stayed composed found themselves feeling unexpectedly emotional. The older man from earlier leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes just to absorb the music more deeply. A woman who had entered the event with a distracted mind now found tears softening the corners of her eyes. It wasn't the complexity of the piece that moved them. It was the sincerity, the deep, quiet sincerity that only came from someone who had lived through struggles quietly and learned to turn them into beauty. Her hands didn't shake this time. They moved with purpose, with clarity, as if they had found their home on the keys. As the melody progressed, she added small flourishes, delicate touches that made the music feel personal. Not planned, not rehearsed, just felt. A soft harmony entered the piece, her left hand joining her right in a gentle dance across the keyboard. The sound grew richer, fuller, yet still carried that intimate quality that made people listen not just with their ears, but with their hearts. There was something healing in the music, something warm, something quietly powerful. At one point, as her fingers pressed a soft chord, she allowed herself to look up, not at the audience directly, but at the space beyond them. Her gaze softened, and something inside her relaxed. She felt like she belonged here. The realization surprised her. She had spent her whole life feeling like she was on the outside of moments like this, watching others shine while she worked in the background. But now, sitting at the center of a room full of people who listened to her with pure respect, she felt a sense of belonging she had never allowed herself to dream about. Her melody dipped, then rose gently, like a quiet breath taken after holding on to emotion for too long. She felt each note in her chest as much as beneath her fingertips. Minutes passed, though she wasn't counting. She simply played until she felt the music reach its natural end. The final notes fell like soft droplets of rain, disappearing into the stillness. When the last sound faded, she lifted her hands slowly from the keys. Silence wrapped around the room, a deep, meaningful silence. Then, gradually, applause began, soft at first, almost hesitant, as if people were afraid to break the spell she had created. But the applause grew, rising like a wave. The warmth in the sound reached her immediately, touching a place inside her she rarely acknowledged. She bowed her head slightly, her eyes lowering in quiet gratitude. She didn't smile widely. She didn't step forward to bask in the praise. She didn't need to. The moment itself was enough. As she stepped away from the piano, someone stood up in the audience. Others followed. Soon, nearly the entire room was on their feet, clapping sincerely, not because she was unexpected, not because she surprised them, but because she moved them. She didn't know how to process the sight of an entire hall standing for her. She simply took another quiet breath and stepped off the stage. Behind the curtain, the coordinator moved toward her quickly, excitement all over his face. That was even better than the first, he told her. People are amazed. I've never seen a crowd react that way at this event. She shook her head gently. I just played what I felt. He smiled. Exactly. And that's why it was incredible. She let out a soft laugh, one she didn't realize she'd been holding inside for years. It wasn't loud, but it was real. Moments later, several guests approached again, each wanting to speak to her briefly. Their words were kind, their tones warm. One guest asked if she had ever considered pursuing music professionally. Another asked if she gave lessons. A third simply thanked her for reminding them what real music felt like. Each compliment made her heart feel a little lighter. She didn't need fame. She didn't need grand promises. But knowing her music had touched people, it was something she quietly cherished. When she returned to the staff room later, she sat down on a small bench near the lockers. Her hands rested on her lap, still tingling from the intensity of the performance. She felt tired, but not in a draining way. It was the kind of tired that came after doing something meaningful. She looked down at her fingers for a moment, tracing the lines of her palms. She whispered softly to herself, almost as if afraid anyone else would hear, "I can really do this." Not as a dream, not as a maybe, but as something real. For the first time in her life, she believed it, and she didn't know it yet. But someone in that crowd had been watching her with a different kind of interest. Someone who would change the course of her life even more in the coming hours. She had no idea that her night already extraordinary was about to take a turn she never saw coming. The moment the hall emptied, silence settled like a soft blanket over the room. Only the faint hum of the ceiling lights remained, along with a distant echo of footsteps disappearing down the corridor. She stood near the piano for a moment, her hand resting lightly on its wooden edge, almost as if she were saying a quiet thank you to something that had changed her life. It didn't feel real yet. Everything that had happened from the first step she took toward the stage to the moment the crowd rose for her felt like a long, bright dream. She needed a moment to breathe, to take in what all of it meant. She slowly walked backstage, where a few staff members were still moving around, packing equipment and shutting things down. They smiled at her in a warm, familiar way, nothing loud, nothing exaggerated, just simple, genuine respect. That was something she had not felt in a long time. One of them offered her a bottle of water. She took it with a gentle nod and sat on a folded chair against the wall, letting herself settle into the quiet. Her mind drifted back to the first day she stepped onto the stage just to clean it. She remembered the tiredness in her legs from standing at the diner for long hours. She remembered the way people sometimes ignored her or assumed she had nothing special to offer. She remembered the way she kept her music locked inside her because she believed nobody would care to hear it. But now, after everything that had happened, those memories felt distant, like shadows slowly fading away behind her dot. As she sat there, she noticed the door on the opposite side of the hallway open. The older judge who had spoken to her earlier walked in. He looked different, now less strict, more relaxed, as if he had finally allowed himself to be nothing more than a person instead of a judge. When he reached her, he didn't say anything right away. He just looked at her with kind eyes, the kind that saw everything she had gone through without needing it explained. That was more than a performance, he finally said. That was a reminder of why music exists. She felt a warm flutter in her chest. Compliments were nice, but this felt different. It felt sincere, not polished or staged. She simply nodded, unsure of the right words to respond with. He took a seat on a nearby stool, shifting slightly to face her. "You may not realize this yet," he continued, "but tonight opened doors for you, doors you never knew were there." She lowered her gaze for a second, feeling the weight of that thought. The idea of new doors scared her a little, but it also sparked something inside her that she had not felt in years' hope. True, steady hope. Before she could reply, one of the hall organizers hurried in, holding a phone in her hand. "You need to see this," the organizer said before handing the phone to her. The screen showed a clip of her performance, already spreading online. Thousands of views. Hundreds of comments. People from all over saying how moved they were, how her playing made them cry, how her expression, her hands, her posture, everything made them feel something deep. Her breath caught in her chest. She didn't know how to process that. Just a few hours ago, she had been someone who cleaned tables and took orders. Someone who quietly hummed tunes in the kitchen when no one was listening. Someone people barely noticed. And now strangers were sharing her performance, talking about her as if she were someone important. The organizer smiled at her. This is just the beginning. There are people asking who you are. They want to know your story. They want to hear more. She handed the phone back with shaky fingers. She didn't dislike the attention. She just didn't understand how so much could change so quickly. It felt almost unreal. She stood up slowly, feeling her legs steady beneath her. "I just wanted to play," she said softly. "I didn't expect anything else." And that, the judge said with a small smile, is exactly why they listened. After a few more moments of quiet talk, the judge excused himself, giving her a respectful nod before leaving. She watched him go, thinking about the strange way life had surprised her. She wondered what the next day would bring. But even without answers, she felt calmer than she had in a long time. When she stepped outside the hall, the cool night air touched her face. The street was mostly empty, lit only by a few lamps and the soft glow of nearby shops preparing to close for the night. She wrapped her arms around herself to keep warm and began walking slowly toward the bus stop. Her steps were unhurried. For once, she wasn't rushing anywhere. She wasn't trying to beat the clock or reach home before exhaustion overtook her. She was simply walking and thinking. She passed by a small cafe where a young couple sat inside. They were laughing quietly, sharing a slice of cake. She smiled a little, imagining how many nights she had dreamed of moments just as simple and peaceful. Life had been heavy for so long that she had forgotten how gentle it could be. A little further down the street, she saw an elderly man sitting on a bench, feeding a stray cat with pieces of bread. She stopped a moment just to watch. There was something comforting about the sight, something that reminded her that even in a busy world, there were still small acts of kindness happening everywhere. When she reached the bus stop, she sat on the empty bench and looked up at the night sky. A few stars peeked through the thin clouds. She let her thoughts drift, remembering the way her fingers had moved across the piano, the way the music seemed to flow through her, as if it had been waiting inside her for years. She closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "Maybe this is my chance." The bus arrived with a soft hiss. She stepped on, tapping her card, and found a seat near the window. As the bus began to move, she rested her head against the glass, watching the city lights blur into streaks of gold and blue. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Maybe interviews. Maybe invitations. Maybe offers she had never imagined. Or maybe just another simple day. But whatever it was, she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer the person who doubted herself. Something inside her had shifted, opened, awakened. When the bus stopped near her street, she got off and walked the rest of the way home. The road was quiet, lined with trees whose leaves rustled softly in the breeze. The familiar scent of the neighborhood comforted her, a mix of distant cooking, warm dust, and evening air. She reached her small apartment, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. It was dim but cozy. She turned on a lamp, the warm light filling the room gently. She placed her bag on the table, slipped off her shoes, and took a slow breath. Her old keyboard sat in the corner. It was worn, some keys slightly discolored, but she loved it because it had been with her through everything. She walked over to it, sat down on the little stool, and let her fingers rest on the keys. She didn't play anything grand, nothing that would shake a hall or move a crowd to tears. Instead, she played a simple tune she had written long ago, one she used to hum during long shifts. It was soft, calming, like a lullaby for the soul. As she played, she realized something. They hadn't just heard her music tonight. They had heard her story. The story of someone who had been overlooked, underestimated, and forgotten. Someone who had carried a quiet dream in her heart without expecting it to ever come true. Someone who never stopped loving music, even when life told her she had no time for it. She finished the tune and lifted her hands from the keys. Tears gathered in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of knowing that she no longer had to hide who she was. She got up and walked to the window, pulling the curtains aside. The street below was silent, lit by a single street lamp. She leaned against the glass and whispered a quiet thank you to life, to music, to the strange twist of events that had brought her here. Tomorrow might be unpredictable, she thought, but for the first time in her life, she felt ready for it. She turned off the lamp, letting the soft moonlight fill the room. She lay down on her bed, feeling the weight of the day settle into her body. It wasn't a heavy weight anymore. It was warm, like something earned. And as her eyes closed, one final thought drifted through her mind. This was not the end of her story. It was only the beginning.